In Matthew chapter 19 tonight, and we are nearing the end of our Lord's life, as we've talked about. He is on his way to Jerusalem now. He is headed toward the last week of his life, very close to that, a couple of weeks maybe away, something like that, maybe not even that far away. And as he is nearing Jerusalem, the Pharisees try to snag him again and ensnare him, like they have on many occasions, trying to ensnare him in an issue where they can pose a question to him and make him look bad, or maybe even get him in trouble politically, or with the people, discredit him. Any number of ways they've tried to trip him up. This time they feel like they have the perfect topic, and that is divorce. Because Jesus is actually being drawn into a huge cultural debate on this occasion in Matthew chapter 19. And in response to the question that Jesus is asked in verse 3, where the Pharisees say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? In answer to that, Jesus basically gives a marriage seminar. And he starts way back before answering the question and goes all the way back to Genesis to lay a foundation for dealing with the question. Now, the question basically, as we saw last week, I'm just doing a little bit of review right now. The question was about a very hotly debated topic in Jesus' day, and the controversy in Jesus' day surrounded around how you interpreted Deuteronomy 24. Now, we're going to look at Deuteronomy 24 a little bit later. I'm not going to do it right now, but basically, Deuteronomy 24 said if a man marries someone and she becomes displeasing to him because he finds some indecency in her, and then if he writes her a bill of divorcement, and then if several other things happen, then there's a command given later in the passage. But the controversy in Jesus' day was over what does that word indecency mean. There were two schools of thought among the rabbis, the religious teachers in Israel. One school of thought was very liberal, very permissive, said that word indecent, or uncleanness, as some translations render it, is very broad, can mean practically anything. If she's displeasing to you for any reason, I mean, uncleanness could mean the house is not clean enough. She burned your dinner, anything. For any reason, you could divorce your wife. And that was the prevailing view in Israel in Jesus' day. That was the majority view, was the very liberal, wide meaning of that, to basically say you could divorce your wife over anything, and it was perfectly fine. Moses gives you permission to do that. The other school of thought was a more narrow view of that passage, which said basically the word uncleanness means any sexual immorality, and if that is the case, then divorce is allowed. Now that's the position Jesus is put in. They would expect him to take the more narrow view, but that would be the unpopular view in Jesus' day. And so they can discredit him with the people if he does that. Plus, as you recall, he's in Herod's territory, and it was this very kind of issue that Herod threw John the Baptist into prison over and ended up beheading him. And so there's a little bit of another angle here the Pharisees are working, like, if we can get him arrested, maybe we can get him beheaded too, and our problem is solved. We've gotten rid of Jesus. So they feel like they have the perfect trap now. They've tried many other times, and they have failed. They will yet try again in the temple on Tuesday of the week Jesus dies. They will fire questions at him again to try to trap him. But this one they feel like they've got the perfect trap. In Jesus' answer, he actually does not start by answering their question. Their question is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? In other words, are you on the side of the prevailing view, Rabbi Hillel, or are you on the more narrow view, Rabbi Shammai? Which view do you take? Do you take the view that is popular with most people, that Deuteronomy 24 is teaching you can divorce your wife for any and every reason, no matter what it is. It's perfectly fine. Moses would smile at that and nod and say, you're perfectly okay. Well, Jesus' answer is, He doesn't even deal with divorce. He will later, and that's why it's important to put all this together. But Jesus begins by going back to Genesis 2 and forming a foundation for why divorce would even be permitted in the first place. The foundation is, and the most important thing to establish whenever you begin to talk about divorce and remarriage, even in our day, the most important thing to establish is what was God's original intent. That's where you have to start. And that's what Jesus does. He goes back to Genesis 2, and basically He gives the divine intent for marriage. That's the first teaching that Jesus does in verses 4 through 6. The divine intent of marriage. And Jesus basically says 5 things going back to Genesis 2 about marriage. This is His marriage seminar. Okay, the first thing is, marriage is a divinely appointed union. A divinely appointed union. Look at verse 4. Haven't you read, He replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female. Okay, at the beginning, the Creator, when He created mankind, created male and female. So He's going all the way back to Genesis 2, where God created mankind. And He created the male and female. So He's going back to the very establishment of marriage, where God created Adam, saw that it was not good for him to be alone, created Eve, and established the first marriage. So Jesus is going back to the very beginning when marriage was established in the Garden of Eden, where God, in creation, established marriage and gave it its purpose. Now, in order to understand fully what Jesus is talking about by going all the way back to the beginning, you have to understand that the purpose for marriage is very clearly identified in Genesis chapter 2. Do you remember Genesis 2:18? God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him." The old word that we often use, help meet. We've kind of combined that into one word, and a wife is a helpmeet. Well, actually, those were 2 English words, a helper, meet for him in the old King James language. Basically, more modern terminology, a helper suitable for him. And the next few verses talk about the fact that Adam named all of the animals. And he sees all these animals coming, and they've got mates. They've got a corresponding partner. But among the animals, there is none found suitable for Adam. There's not another human being on the earth. And that's why the Bible says God created Eve, brought her to the man, and introduced her. And you remember, Adam named her woman. And I've always thought that when he took his first look at her, he said, "Whoa, man!" And that's how she got her name, woman. That's King John translation. I'm not sure that's appropriate, but at any rate, God brings them together, and the reason is it is not good for the man to be alone. So there is the purpose established for marriage in the very beginning, and that is companionship. They complete one another. Among the animal kingdom, there is not one like Adam. So in marriage, there is one who complements him, who completes him, who is a perfect companion for him, and that was why marriage was divinely appointed. They complete one another. They complement one another. And it's very clear in Genesis 2 that their union, physically, sexually, is the means of continuing the human race. And so, from the very beginning, sex is placed within the context of a monogamous marriage, a faithful union of husband and wife. And so that's the very beginning. That's the divine appointment of marriage. God established it. God laid down its character. God gave it its purpose. God set the boundaries of the physical expression of love and sex in marriage. No person has a right to change that. No court has a right to change that. No president, congressman, whoever has a right to change that. God established it and gave it its purpose in the beginning. And that's what Jesus goes back to. That is foundational. Marriage is a divinely appointed union. It is not defined or prescribed by any human court. And that's why for Bible-believing Christians, no human court dictates what we believe about marriage. The Bible does. And the Bible makes it very clear in the beginning that it was a divinely appointed union for husband and wife to complete one another, be companions for one another, and then continue the human race. A divinely appointed union. Secondly, Jesus says it is a heterosexual union. Again, look at verse 4. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them what? Male and female. And in verse 4, and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. Male, female, man, wife. It is clear that in God's original intent for marriage, in Genesis 2, that's where Jesus is quoting from, in the very beginning, marriage is a heterosexual union. God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Right? God created Eve and Adam, not Eve and Adeline. Right? Okay, you got a man and a woman created. God brings them together. That's how God started it. That's God's original intent and purpose and established pattern for marriage. If Paul had never said a word about that in Romans 1, Genesis 2 would have still told us what God wanted. If Paul had never said a word about it in 1 Corinthians 6, if Paul had never said a word about it in 1 Timothy chapter 2, it still would have been God's appointed design for a man and a woman to be married. Not two men and not two women. It is a heterosexual union clearly from the very beginning. The Bible clearly teaches, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, that homosexuality is a perversion of God's intended sexual expression. I do not care what is politically correct. I really do not. I care only about what is biblically correct. And our culture is so quickly shifting toward not just a toleration of homosexuality, but the homosexual agenda of considering it a basic human right. Our culture is so quickly shifting that way that we must be very clear on what the Bible teaches about this and be willing in the day in which we live to stand on that, regardless of what that costs us. Now, I hope you hear what I'm saying, regardless of what that costs us, either as individuals or as a church. Because very quickly our culture and the political spectrum is shifting that direction. And we've got to be willing to say, no, I'm not going there. I'm not budging 1 inch. I'm sticking with what the Bible says. And if that becomes against the law of the land, so be it. The Bible is very clear on that issue. Now, having said that, homosexuality as a perversion of God's intended design for sex is no different than any other sin. Maybe in its social consequences, yes. But as far as God is concerned, any perversion of His intended will and purpose is sin. Any sin can be forgiven. Any sinner should be loved and brought to Christ. And so by taking a strong stand against homosexuality and insisting that marriage is a heterosexual union, that in no way means that we hate homosexuals or we're homophobic. It's not at all. We love everyone, and we want everyone to come to Christ. That does not mean we will tolerate sinful lifestyles, however, that the Bible clearly talks about. So, going back to the very beginning, it's very clear from what Jesus says and what God established in Genesis 2 that marriage is a heterosexual union. Third key principle in Jesus' marriage seminar in verse 5 is that marriage is a primary union. It is a primary union. Verse 5 says, and said, Jesus is still quoting from Genesis 2. The Creator said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. Okay, take that part of Genesis 2:24, the verse that Jesus is quoting from, and you find that God's original intent is that marriage be considered the primary union. It is the primary human relationship, not the parent-child relationship. So what he says is that a man leaves his father and mother. That doesn't mean you completely forsake them, never talk to them again, anything like that. But the relationship, which has up till that point been the primary relationship in your life, your relationship with your parents, now you have a new primary relationship. And that is your relationship with your husband or your wife. And both the newlyweds and parents need to understand that drastic shift in relationship. Because there is a tremendous change there, where the primary focus now becomes on husband and wife. And even parents need to understand that the primary relationship is to let their children go and live their marriage. And there's no longer the capability to have the same kind of parent-child relationship in the sense of discipline and training and all of those kinds of things. Certainly still throughout the rest of your adult life you'll be able to model and so forth for your children. But there is not the same relationship after your children get married. Now, in many ways it can grow deeper and closer, but the parent-child relationship, the primacy of that, gives way to the primacy of the marriage relationship. And it is the husband-wife relationship which is primary. That is the primary human relationship. So parents, don't interfere. I tell couples in premarital counseling, accept parental advice, resist parental interference. You can usually tell the difference between the two. Advice is usually, not always, but usually asked for. Sometimes advice is given because it's needed, whether or not it's asked for, but you can usually tell the difference, even in tone. But parents, be careful about interfering in your children's marriage. Okay? The primary relationship they have now is with their mate. They can have a very deep and close relationship with you, but that's not the primary one anymore. It's a primary union. Fourth thing Jesus teaches about marriage in verse 5 is that marriage is a physical union. Verse 5, he says, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Now the one flesh, that phrase primarily refers to the sexual union of husband and wife. Not exclusively. There are other things included in becoming one flesh, but primarily it refers to the sexual union. It's important in marriage to be of one mind, to be of one heart, to be of one spirit. But if Jesus were talking and God were talking about the primary relationship is one spirit, well, then death would not nullify marriage. Death would not end the marriage relationship because your spirit lives on. See, this is primarily a physical union. The basic union in marriage is the sexual union. When husband and wife come together sexually, that brings two people together on the most intimate level, and in God's eyes, they become one. Now, that's why Paul objects to sexual relations with a harlot, because he says it makes you one flesh. When you engage in sexual relationships with a harlot, it makes you one flesh with that person. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 16, he says it very plainly. 1 Corinthians 6:16, he says, "Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body?" And then notice he quotes Genesis 2:24. "For it is said, the two will become one flesh." The one flesh relationship, Paul quite clearly indicates, comes about as a result of the physical sexual union of two people. Even a man with a prostitute, they become one flesh. And that is the reason why immorality is so damaging. God created sex to be enjoyed only within the marriage relationship. There is no such thing as casual sex. Not in God's eyes. Because any sexual relationship causes you to become one flesh with that person. In God's eyes, that's marriage. That's designed only for marriage. You see, we are not animals. We are not created like animals. Indiscriminate, many animals in partners. We're not created that way. God created people, designed us only for sexual union within the husband and wife relationship, to cause two people to become one flesh that unites them physically, emotionally, spiritually. It's all brought about by that sexual union. We're not animals. We are human beings for whom sex establishes a one flesh union designed only for marriage. And that's why the Bible teaches it is so important to save yourself for marriage, and after you are married, to keep sexuality within marriage. That's why that's so important. Because that's the way God designed it, and any violation of that is going to bring untold physical, emotional, spiritual harm, because you've broken the most basic rule of human relationships. That's why that is so critical. You say, "John, why are you so passionate about that tonight?" Because that is so countercultural today. I mean, it is being drilled into us that sex is fine as long as you love somebody or care about somebody. That's what teenagers hear all the time. All kinds of excuses are made for sexual immorality. God designed those boundaries for our blessing and our protection. Violate those boundaries, and you have all kinds of harm that come into your life. So, marriage is a physical union, and there are reasons for that. The fifth thing Jesus says about marriage is that marriage is a permanent union. Verse 6. It's a permanent union. It's divinely appointed, heterosexual, the primary human relationship, physical union, and it is a permanent union. Verse 6 says, "So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." In other words, the divine intent is to spend your life together. In God's view of marriage, there is no such thing as a trial marriage. There's no such thing as, well, let's live together for a while and then we'll see if it works. That's not God's view of marriage. God's view of marriage is that you spend your life together. That you enter marriage with a commitment to that being for a lifetime, which means you will be committed to working out problems rather than just bailing out when they come along. Marriage, again I say, is not a casual union, regardless of all the movies that promote that today. And they're coming out by the handful. Regardless of what Hollywood says. And just in case you wonder, I haven't seen any of them, but that's the very reason I subscribe to USA Today, so I can read music and movie reviews and culture stuff and keep up with what's going on. But movies like Love and Other Drugs and Friends with Benefits, No Strings Attached, and the list could probably go on, are continually pumping at our young people. You can have casual sex with anyone you want to and just go right on about your life. You cannot do that without damage to your life. You cannot do that. Marriage is not a casual union. It is not a dating relationship. It is not a friendship that if it doesn't work out, well, you can just say, well, that didn't work out, let's go on, let's move on. That is not what marriage is. Marriage is a binding union for a lifetime. Say, wow, John, you're awful narrow, aren't you? Well, that's where Jesus begins. Okay? And that's where you have to begin, with the original intent, God's intent. Now Jesus is going to deal with some of the other issues that arise. But you have to begin, if you're going to talk about marriage and divorce, you've got to begin where Jesus began, and that is with the proper understanding of God's original intent in marriage. And it is very clear. It's a divinely appointed union. It's not defined by human courts. It's not defined by human legislators. It's defined by God. And God very clearly defined it. It is a heterosexual union. It is a primary union. It is a physical union. It is a permanent union. That's Jesus' marriage seminar. That's what He teaches about marriage. Now, look at what happens next, because Jesus is now going to get into the topic of the human destruction of marriage. In verse 7, notice what happens with the Pharisees. The Pharisees are the ones that had asked Him the original question back in verse 3. Verse 7, why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Now, do you understand what's happening here? They have not heard a thing Jesus said deeply. They haven't really heard what Jesus said. All they heard was that last statement. What God has joined together, let no one separate. That's all they've heard. And so what they're thinking, they've missed the whole point about God's intent. They catch only that last statement, and they think, that's the sort of strong pronouncement that we were hoping to get out of Him. We were hoping to get the very narrow view of no divorce or only in very rare circumstances. We were hoping He would go counter the majority opinion. That's exactly what we wanted to hear. And we got that out of Him. The trap is sprung in their mind, and they've got Him. They've got Him right where they want Him. So they close in for the kill. Why then, if you say this about marriage, why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce? Don't you realize, Jesus, what you've taught is against Moses? Ooh, boy, they've really got him now, they think. To go against Moses? Wow, that's the death penalty in Israel. What they seem to have failed to realize is they were completely misinterpreting Deuteronomy 24, and Jesus is going to set them straight on it. He's going to talk about the human destruction of marriage. 3 things He will say. The first one, divorce is permitted, not commanded. Divorce is permitted, not commanded. You see, their question in verse 7 was, why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce? Notice what Jesus replies in verse 8. Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I want to, at this point, go back to Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24 reads this way. If you can find it quickly, do so. If not, listen carefully. Here's what Deuteronomy 24, the first 4 verses says. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce. Okay, every statement from here on through verse 3 has that same if before it. It's all under that first word, if. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and you could substitute the word if he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband, verse 4, who divorced her, is not allowed to marry her again after she's been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. You read that passage and you realize there is no command until verse 4. Everything else is a suppositional case leading up to the command. If this happens, and if this happens, and if this happens, and if this happens, and then if this happens, then this is what you're supposed to do. And the command comes in verse 4. Jesus quite clearly corrects them. You say Moses commanded you to divorce your wife? No. That's not what Moses said in Deuteronomy 24. Moses permitted divorce, but did not command it. A husband is never commanded to divorce his wife in Deuteronomy 24. It is just a recognition that divorce will occur. It's going to happen. If this happens, then that happens, that happens, that happens. It's a recognition that it will happen. So, divorce in Moses' passage, and what Jesus is saying, was permitted. Jesus uses that word in verse 8. Moses permitted you. So, divorce is permitted, it is allowed, it is tolerated, it is never commanded. Moses' instruction actually was designed to protect the sacredness of marriage by stopping the attitude that you could have serial marriages. It was really, Moses' statement was basically designed to say, if one guy divorces her and then the second guy doesn't like her and he divorces her and the first guy says, I think I'll get her back. What is happening there is kind of a very low view of marriage. Kind of a letting go of the sacredness of the marriage union. And Moses was actually saying, okay, it's got to stop somewhere, so no, the first husband cannot take her back. It's gone far enough. There's been enough to happen where that's detestable in the eyes of the Lord. And what he's saying is not the problems that may have caused difficulties in marriages. What he's saying is the whole view of marriage, that it is just a temporary thing and can be repeated any number of times, is really tantamount to a low view of marriage. That's what Jesus is saying. Okay? So divorce is permitted, but it is never commanded. Second thing he says, also in verse 8, is that divorce was a concession to man's sinfulness. It's very important that we understand this. Divorce was a concession to man's sinfulness. Verse 8, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. God's original plan for marriage left no room for divorce. Remember, one woman, one man together for life was the Genesis 2 intent. But that was before sin entered the world. God knew that sin would come into the world. He knew that sin would end up messing up all kinds of things, including God's ideal for marriage. God knew that man's heart in many cases would be hardened to the mind and the will of God when it came to marriage, and we would make a mess of it. we would make a mess of marriage and would resort to divorce. God knew that would happen. So God makes provision, permits, tolerates, if you will. He makes provision for people in cases where regrettably human sinfulness has failed to maintain the ideal that was established in the Garden of Eden. That's why Moses permitted divorce. Because of sin. It was not God's original intent, Jesus says, but it was permitted because of sin. Think of it this way. This is exactly like any other sin. God's ideal for us is perfect holiness, right? And it's clear. God's ideal is that we not sin. But God knows that we will not always keep that ideal. He knows that we will sin. And therefore He makes provision for us when we do sin. That's exactly what Deuteronomy 24 was about. And that's what Jesus is talking about when He says Moses permitted, He tolerated, He allowed. Divorce is never God's ideal. But sometimes it is the best option to protect someone where the ideal has been shattered and has been so messed up that it can't be repaired. So sometimes, yes, divorce is allowed. It is permitted. It is tolerated by God. He makes provision for that because He knows that in our sinfulness, our hardened hearts, we're going to make a mess of the ideal of marriage just like we make a mess of every other ideal that God created us to be. And so God is not saying there should never be any divorce. He's saying the ideal is that there should never be, but none of us live up to the ideal in every area of our lives. And so some people are going to mess up the ideal of marriage. When that happens, there is a provision for people. It is permitted, it is allowed, but remember, that was never God's original intent. So divorce is permitted, not commanded. It is a concession to man's sinfulness. And then the third thing Jesus says here in His teaching about divorce is that divorce is permitted under certain circumstances. Verse 9. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Now what Jesus is doing here is giving an example of what He's just talked about in verse 8. An example of a case where the original intent for marriage has been shattered. And the divine ideal has been shattered. So now divorce is permitted or tolerated because of the shattering of the ideal. Now, basically, verse 9 is a very strong statement about marriage. He's basically saying, don't have a loose attitude toward marriage. The basic statement is, I tell you, if anyone divorces his wife and marries another woman, commits adultery. That's the basic statement. There's an exception in there, but the basic statement is, hold marriage high. The attitude that you can divorce for any and every reason, which was the popular view in Jesus' day, is wrong. It's the same thing as adultery. That's what Jesus is saying. But, He says, there is an exception. And that exception is if the ideal of the marriage union has been shattered by adultery. And the word adultery means any type of sexual sin, any type of sexual immorality. The reason for that is, remember, even in this case, divorce is not commanded. It is permitted. It is allowed by God. And the reason is, the one flesh relationship has been violated. It's been shattered. The ideal is now gone. There is now, especially with adultery, a new one flesh relationship that's been established with someone else. And so God's ideal has been shattered. And God allows or permits divorce in this case. Now, here's the point I think it's important to see. I do not believe that it was Jesus' intent to teach everything about divorce and remarriage with this one statement. Jesus was giving an example of what He has said in verse 8. Divorce is tolerated, it is permitted, it is allowed when the divine ideal is shattered. because of man's sinfulness. And Jesus gives one example, adultery. I know that Jesus did not mean that that's the only reason for divorce and remarriage, because Paul clearly adds another exception in 1 Corinthians 17. And that is, if an unsaved mate of a believing partner deserts you, then you are freed from the marriage bond. Divorce is permitted in that case as well. So I am not personally convinced that Jesus or even those two statements are intending to give us, these are the two exclusive things. I think what God is basically saying, the divine ideal is clear. Always maintain that, always promote that, always believe that, always strive for that. There are times when the divine ideal is shattered. In those cases, divorce is permitted. Now, if I can very quickly summarize verses 10 through 12, I'm not sure I can quickly do that, but let me try. The divine provision of marriage Jesus talks about. In verse 10, the disciples said to Him, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry. Now, what they're saying is basically, Jesus, you took the very narrow view of divorce and remarriage. You're saying you can't divorce for any reason? Then if that's the case, that's such a high ideal, it'd be better to stay single, right? And Jesus is going to say, no. Wait a second. Verse 11, Jesus replied, not everyone can accept this word. Now, the big debate here is what the term this word refers to. I believe it refers back to what the disciples have just said. It is better not to marry. Better to stay single, right? If marriage is such a high ideal, wouldn't it be better to stay single? And Jesus is saying not everybody can accept that statement. Not everybody can do that. But only those to whom it has been given. What he's talking about is the same thing Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 7. Only those to whom the gift of celibacy has been given. Only those who have the special ability given by God to remain single, to not be married, and to resist the temptation to sexual sin, control sexual passion, God-given sexual passion, so that you do not need marriage. Those are the only people that Jesus says can tolerate that word the disciples have just said, can stay single. And Jesus even gives us some examples of the kind of people He's talking about in verse 12 or 13. No, 12. For there are eunuchs who were born that way. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. In other words, some people will never marry because of physical deformity or something that has been done to them by others. Or, he says, there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. That was Paul's case. Paul makes it very clear in 1 Corinthians 7, he had the gift of celibacy. He was able to remain celibate, to remain above sexual temptation. He did not need marriage. Jesus is saying it is only those people who can tolerate that word, disciples, that you should stay single. The one who can accept this should accept it. Now, here's my conclusion. That is the reason why I will marry people who've been divorced. I've been criticized for that position. It's not the most popular position among pastors, but that's the reason why I will marry people who've been divorced. I will always seek to address issues that may have caused the divorce, but to require people to stay single after they've been divorced, I think violates just what Jesus taught. There are only certain people who can take what the disciples said, it's better to stay single, and Jesus puts Himself exactly where Paul was, only those who are gifted to stay above sexual temptation and do not need marriage, only those people should stay single. That's, I believe, what Jesus was saying here. And so for that reason, I think it's inadvisable to tell people if you've been divorced, you automatically have the gift of celibacy. You're supposed to stay single the rest of your life. I don't think that's appropriate. In most cases, it is probably better for that person to remarry. Now, again, having said that, I will always seek to address with people any issues that have led up to the divorce that need to be corrected and dealt with before a person enters into another union with someone else. Because if those things are not corrected, you just pile problems on top of problems, and you end up having more divorces. But you see, Jesus gives us a whole package of teaching here. First of all, the sacredness of marriage, but then understanding why people will be divorced, why it is permitted, why it is allowed, and why, when sin breaks up the ideal, it is in most cases not advisable for people to try to stay single. To the best of my ability to understand that passage, that's what Jesus is saying. I did do a lot of talking tonight, didn't I? And we're 5 minutes over. I apologize.